Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about solving absolute value equations. This is something you might have covered in Algebra 1. Most Algebra 1 courses don't cover it. When I made my lecture series on Algebra 1, it's something I didn't cover. So this is probably something new to you if you're just following my videos. So the first thing I want to do is I want to start out with a refresher on absolute value. And at this point in your math career, if you're in Algebra 2, you should basically be very familiar with this concept of absolute value. But essentially, the absolute value of a number is the distance, the distance between the number and 0 on the number line. So two really quick examples. Let's say we have the absolute value of 2. What is that equal to? Well, I think most of you know that that's equal to 2. But to prove this, look at 2 on your number line. 2 is right here, 0 is right here, and 2 is 2 units away from 0. It doesn't matter the direction you have to move to get to 0, it's just in terms of how far do I have to move, okay? So it's 2 units away from 0, so the absolute value of 2 is 2. Now also, negative 2 has an absolute value of 2 because you have to move 2 units to get from negative 2 to 0 as well. So look, you go 2 units that way to get to 0. So two numbers with the same absolute value, like we just saw, 2 and negative 2, are called opposites or additive inverses. So for example, 4 and negative 4, or 6 and negative 6, or let's say 1025 and negative 1025. Scroll over a little bit. Okay, those would all be opposites, and as we just saw, each would have the same absolute value. So 4 and negative 4 would have an absolute value of 4. 6 and negative 6 would have an absolute value of 6, and 1025 and negative 1025 would have an absolute value of 1025. And just one more quick point before we get into actually solving equations. Two numbers can only have the same absolute value if they are the same number. So obviously, if you have the same number, like 2 and 2, right, that's going to have the same absolute value. And then opposites of each other, okay, opposites of each other. So 2 and negative 2 would have the same absolute value. Let's look at something easy to get started. Let's say we have the absolute value of x equals 7. So what am I asking for here? I'm asking for what numbers can I plug in for x there and get a true statement. So plug something in for x, take the absolute value of it, and get a 7. So what two numbers do we know of that have an absolute value of 7? Where there's 7 and there's negative 7. Each is 7 units away from 0 on the number line. So when you see something like this, basically you're going to think about just saying that x could be equal to what? It could be equal to 7, or it could be equal to the negative of 7. Okay, so in general, to solve an absolute value equation of the form, here we have the absolute value of ax plus b equals k, we solve the following two equations. Ax plus b could be equal to k, right, positive k, or ax plus b could be equal to the negative of k. Because if we take the absolute value, okay, it's going to end up being positive, okay? So in other words, if this ends up being equal to negative k, once we take the absolute value of it, it ends up being positive k. And I know when we start working with kind of abstract stuff, it gets confusing. Well, let's jump in and look at an example. So we have the absolute value of 8x plus 4 equals 28. So following that rule, we would set up these two equations. 8x plus 4 could be equal to 28, or 8x plus 4 could be equal to negative 28. Okay, you're going to solve those two equations. I have a hard time getting that on the screen. Let me kind of scroll this over a little bit. And again, if 8x plus 4 would be equal to negative 28, meaning I got a value here of negative 28, right, I plugged in some number for x, I multiplied it by 8, I added 4 to it, and I got negative 28 as a result. Once I take the absolute value of it, I'll have a true statement because it will be equal to positive 28. Okay, that's what absolute value does. It takes a negative number and makes it positive. Alright, so let's solve these two simple equations. We will subtract 4 away from each side here. That will go away. I'll have 8x is equal to 24. I'll divide each side by 8. And we'll have x equals 3. X equals 3. So that's one solution. Okay, and then we have this OR. Now I'm going to subtract 4 away from each side here. I'll have 8x is equal to negative 32. I'll divide each side by 8. That'll cancel with that. And I'll have x equals negative 4 as another solution. So my solution set here